I want you here. How would you like to set the panel? Should we go geographically or alphabetically? What does Rob talk about? Korea? So we should go zoom in. So we got India. Sure.
Putting myself on the teleprompter here, so. Okay, let's do this in a way.
You don't have a PowerPoint, do you?
No, no. I just,
I would just be careful because I'd imagine as you type, it'll.
yep. Good.
Never. Still trying to herd a few people back in. We'll start in just a minute.
Jacques, how much time do each of us have?
15.
15 minutes, okay.
There's certainly no more than that. All right. I'd like to welcome everybody back for our second session here. Thanks to Chihoko Goto and her colleagues here at the Wilson Center for cooperating again with FPRI. We've really enjoyed doing this in past sessions and are happy to be back here today. And thanks, as always, to Ambassador Stape Roy for giving us a terrific keynote. I think he's left us a few things to talk about on this panel, although I'm feeling a little preempted. But we have plenty of things we can drill down into, and we have an excellent panel here to deal with it in the next I guess, hour and a half or so. So let me introduce our panel briefly. You have their bios, but let me just hit a couple of highlights. I think we're just going to go down the row here as people are seated. So that means we'll start with Shumit Ganguly, who is an FPRI Senior Fellow and holds the Rabindranath Tagore. Did I get anywhere close to that?
Close.
Close. All right. I do China, not India. I can only do one exotic language. Chair in Indian Cultures and Civilization. And is the director of the Center on American and Global Security at Indiana University, Bloomington. He's been a fellow and a guest scholar right here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and has also written, I think, 20-some books. I lost count a long time ago, but an extremely prolific author on many issues, most having close connections to South Asia, and including his latest book, which is Deadly Impasse, Indo-Pakistani Relations at the Dawn of a New Century. He's on the editorial boards of pretty much every journal in the field, and it's always great to have him here with us at FPRI events. Secondly, we have John Haynes. One can introduce people as gentlemen and scholars. He's an entrepreneur and a scholar. I mean that in the nicest possible way. And he's another FPRI Senior Fellow. He's the co-director of FPRI's Eurasia program. His work is focused on Russia and its near abroad, and he has a special interest in nationalist and separatist movements, and has done a great deal on nuclear security issues, particularly nuclear smuggling and terrorism, and the development of technologies to detect and discover concealed fissile material. He is a life member of the U.S. Naval War College Foundation and the U.S. Naval Institute, and has just a quite wide range of activities related to that field. Finally, last but far from least, Robert Litvak, who is Vice President for Scholars and Director of International Security Studies here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. He's also Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Services and a consultant to the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He was on the National Security Council staff as Director for Non-Proliferation. In his bio here says the first Clinton administration. Does that mean first term of Bill Clinton, or are we predicting an electoral outcome?
It was William Jefferson Clinton.
All right.
It wasn't anticipatory.
He's also written a number of books, including Outlier States, American Strategies to Contain, Engage, or Change Regimes, a number of works on rogue states, regime change issues, and so on. He's also held visiting fellowships at Harvard Center for International Affairs, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and the Russian Academy of Sciences. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, as that lineup suggests, we're going to move into some of those areas that were right at the periphery of the core East Asia area that Stape Roy was talking about. So we'll start with South Asia, we'll get into Russia, and I'm sure we'll also have some discussion of the gift that keeps on giving, North Korea. So without further ado, let me pass the microphone over to Shumit.
Do you want me to go?
Wherever you wish. Down here.
I'll just stay here. Thanks again, Jacques, for an exceedingly generous introduction. It's always a delight to work for the FPRI, and it's wonderful to be back yet again to the Wilson Center, where I have spent a fair amount of time in the past. My remarks will primarily concern security issues in South Asia and U.S. interests in South Asia, especially as we look towards a new administration. As Ambassador Stapleton Roy very correctly pointed out in his initial remarks, one can say a great deal about one candidate and very little about another. And I'm afraid I'm faced with exactly that dilemma. One can make certain inferences of what policy is likely to be about under one candidate, but essentially inferences, because one knows next to nothing about that candidate's worldview or let alone grand strategy for the United States, beyond some throwaway remarks about building walls and the like. How might South Asia, what might be the principal issues confronting the next administration in South Asia? Rather than talking about the likely policies of particular administrations or particular individuals, I'm going to focus upon the principal policy challenges that exist and are likely to exist regardless of who assumes office next January. And my remarks are divided into three distinct segments. First, I will talk about global issues, then I'll talk about regional issues affecting South Asia, and then more specifically, talk about bilateral issues, primarily between India and the United States, given India's extraordinary salience in South Asia as the principal country in the region. I'm going to take a fairly expansive view of the notion of security, and one of the issues that invariably will confront the next administration is the issue of climate change. I'm talking about climate change because climate change has significant security consequences, particularly in a region like South Asia, which is likely to see massive migrations of populations as they seek shelter from the dramatic changes in climate that are already underway in the region and which are going to produce massive numbers of refugees, with entire segments of South Asia probably which are going to be inundated as a consequence of the rise of sea levels. And since India is one of the principal contributors to global pollution, India's participation in climate change discussions, which has been anemic thus far, is going to be an extraordinarily compelling issue confronting any administration. Now, obviously, one candidate does not believe that climate change is a scientific fact. I happen to question that position, but so it'll be fascinating to see how this very fraught issue of climate change is dealt with, because this is not an issue that can be set aside by any administration that assumes office next January because of its very compelling and cogent nature. We are also likely to see an attempt to engage India on the question of the South China Sea. This has already been underway under Secretary Carter, who has started discussions with India on the question of the South China Sea. And India has also expressed an interest in the South China Sea because a substantial amount of its trade, particularly with East Asia, flows through that region. So the issue of the South China Sea actually will end up linking the East and South Asia in a way that it has not hitherto been linked. Finally, really peering out into the future, and especially if one administration comes to office, we may yet see the resurrection of an issue that has, for the most part, been dormant, and that's the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. President Obama, in a famous speech in Prague, had spelt out a vision of a nuclear-free world. Unfortunately, that vision has, for the most part, been set aside. But there have been some periodic references to the resurrection of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and it'll be intriguing to see if this issue is resurrected under a new administration, and if so, India's participation will be absolutely critical, because in the 1998 discussions, India played the vital role of a spoiler in the CTBT negotiations, and this any discussion of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty almost invariably will require India's active participation. Let me turn to a set of three regional issues. One candidate has already made it amply clear that he plans to completely undermine the JCPOA, the agreement that was so carefully knitted together with Iran. If that happens, it will invariably bring India into conflict with the United States, because India has a fairly robust relationship with Iran, partially dependent on Iran for hydrocarbons, dependent on Iran for containing Sunni extremism in the region. And India, which is a little known fact, is the third largest Muslim country in the world, which has its own problems with its very substantial Muslim minority, some of it of its own making. But in this context, Iran remains a vital partner for India, and any attempt to isolate Iran or impose further sanctions on Iran will invariably bring India into conflict with the United States. Then to turn to the two other elephants in the room, Afghanistan. This is one of the most fraught issues that will face the next administration. And it is far from clear how this issue is going to be handled, especially at a time when the American appetite for maintaining a substantial presence in Afghanistan is increasingly declining, and the costs of sustaining such a presence becomes extremely difficult. After having kept India at an arm's length, in its final days, the Obama administration has actively courted India and has sought to grant India and has urged India to adopt a much wider role in Afghanistan, something that the current regime in India seems willing to play. So it remains to be seen how American policy evolves in terms of Afghanistan, and India could play a vital role in stabilizing Afghanistan, because it's a little known fact also that it is the fifth largest aid donor and is widely seen as the most effective aid donor to Afghanistan. And for the first time, India is now also forging a security relationship with Afghanistan as the United States provides a bit more leeway. And finally, to come to an issue which has been very much in the headlines over the course of the last week, is Pakistan's continued dalliance with terror. And while Pakistan continues to dissemble on this issue, whether it involves India or Afghanistan, it is simply a fact that Pakistan uses proxy forces to pursue its strategic interests, both vis-a-vis India and in Afghanistan. And this is an issue that no administration, regardless of its ideological leanings, will be able to gloss over. It has been a trying question with which a number of administrations over the last 2 decades has grappled, but rather ineffectively. But this is a nettle that will have to be grasped. Finally, to turn more directly to India, there are 3 compelling security issues that will confront the next administration. One is a process that has started fitfully in the second Obama administration, and that is the role of weapon sales to India and the role of co-production of weaponry in India, something that was absolutely unimaginable during the bulk of the Cold War years and even beyond. But there is a robust security relationship emerging with India with substantial amounts of weapon sales and the sales of various forms of high technology weaponry. In a related vein, there has been a substantial expansion of military exercises in India, with India. And again, though little known, the United States has more military exercises with India at the present time than with any other country in the world. And much of this has been spearheaded by the US Navy and the Indian Navy, and with the growing expansion of the PLA's Navy in the Indian Ocean, this is a subject that will take on increased significance in the years ahead, without question. Finally, as part and parcel of the growing defense and security relationship, India has finally signed, after much hesitation, one of the so-called foundational agreements which facilitate various forms of defense cooperation. At least 3 more of these foundational agreements are still on the anvil, and India's rather desultory decision-making system has held up the signing of these foundational agreements. But the present regime in India is is very well inclined towards pursuing these foundational agreements, because then they provide the requisite basis for broader defense cooperation with the United States. In the absence of these agreements, any number of efforts at defense cooperation are stultified, and consequently the next administration will have to confront this alphabet soup of foundational agreements with India, especially if it is interested in the broadening of defense cooperation. And in considerable part, to sum this up and to link it with East Asia, much of this defense cooperation is driven by the uncertainty associated with China's rise, its increasing assertiveness, not merely in the South China Sea, but in the Indian Ocean and in the Indian Ocean littoral states, and which has caused considerable concern, not just in Southeast Asia, but particularly in South Asia, especially as far as India is concerned. Pakistan, which has long been an ally of China, obviously views these developments through a very different lens, and in fact welcomes a much wider Chinese footprint in the region. However, this puts India fundamentally at odds with both Pakistan and China, and given the U.S. concerns about Chinese assertiveness, this is where one witnesses a growing convergence of interests, of security interests, between India and the United States. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, and thanks for keeping your time. On to John Haynes.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak this morning. So I come here with a Mrs. Clinton's cough and Mr. Trump's teleprompter, so we'll hope that I can channel the virtues as well as her vices. My brief this morning is to discuss security matters in Asia generally, with specific attention to the articulated doctrines of Secretary Clinton and Mr. Trump. So let me say at the outlet that I take no position on either candidate, which means just that, no position. So in the interest of full disclosure, I spent more time on Mr. Trump than on Secretary Clinton. I believe I've read almost everything that he's said or written over the past 3 decades, so I'll leave it to you to judge how I spend my time. That being said, Secretary Clinton has a well-developed body of thought on these and other subjects that's easily accessible, including recently released emails from her time as Secretary of State. Mr. Trump is more elusive, understandably, I believe, given that he spent his career in business, not in public life. The associated risk in collecting his thoughts and musings and reducing them to a form that one might reasonably call a doctrine is that one might give them a form that they don't merit, in effect turning a shoebox of index cards into something more cogent. So I don't think I've committed that sin, but it's worth raising the point. What I think is more interesting than what positions each candidate may or may not have taken is how each candidate thinks. That is not how they might be expected to respond to questions on Monday evening, but instead how they will think about the inevitable lightning bolt, that unanticipated event with which the next president will surely have to wrestle. So let me start with something President Obama said a few months ago. He said, "The world has changed, the rules are changing with it. The United States, not countries like China, should write them. Other countries should play by the rules that America and our partners set, and not the other way around." So the quick-witted among us might respond that the 1980s are calling and want their foreign policy back. But to be fair, he wrote that in his May 2016 Washington Post op-ed on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's of course true that the United States has been the indispensable element of Asia's post-World War II security architecture. Its network of bilateral security alliances in East Asia, the forward deployment of United States forces in the region, and its at-will capacity to project military power and strategic influence. Even if none of these factors changes on an absolute basis, and as we'll discuss, that's a highly dubious assumption, China and less vocally Russia would suggest that it is entirely dispensable today. I'm persistently befuddled by tropes such as a pivot to Asia and troubled by the suggestion that those tropes are placeholders with intellectual substance. Whatever it may be, and it is the pivot, it's a flat map illusion. That's to say, it makes no sense in a three-dimensional world. It says one can only go so far to the left of the map until one reaches a point where, in order to get to Asia, one has to pivot 180 degrees and head to the right. So why would one pivot on a globe? The trope suggests geographic discontinuity that doesn't in reality exist. Geography isn't discontinuous, nor must be said are most security challenges, which express one place and then re-express someplace else. Now, to be fair, Secretary Clinton isn't alone in using offending tropes. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe once dreamt of a security community that may one day reach from Vancouver to Vladivostok. The implication, of course, is that one heads east across Canada and eventually reaches Vladivostok. The question it begs is, what about the remaining 4,000 nautical miles one has to cross to get back to British Columbia? So the Financial Times of the day attempted to rehabilitate the pivot trope with the headline, "Prospect of Trump Win Threatens U.S.-Asian Pivot in a Spin," or threatens to put U.S.-Asian pivot in a spin. So I thought that was interesting because it implies an axis. So we've partially rehabilitated the idea, and here's why. There are figurative axes in Asia that are self-evidently dangerous. The North Korean-Iran axis is the most obvious one, with its double-barreled threat of pooled talent to develop ballistic missiles topped with nuclear weapons. A much more subtle but perhaps equally dangerous one may just be the idea of an axis itself. And what I mean by that is bilateralism. It implies a territorial and jurisdiction dispute between two states. It seems to me that one of the underrated dangers in Asia today is China's insistence in solving all problems on a bilateral level. It resists United States involvement in these disputes. Other countries may seek United States engagement as a counterbalance to China, with which they cannot act on as an equal partner. And the United States, of course, has its own interests, especially in contentious maritime domains like the South China Sea. As China, in one colorful view, slowly and deliberately excises the maritime heart out of Southeast Asia, it marginalizes ASEAN. The South China Sea is one among several examples we could use, but probably the most patent and therefore the easiest to grasp, is a politically constructed region that is bound only by risk and strategic relevance rather than by identity. That is to say, it is not a geographic feature on the lines of the Caspian Sea with delineated borders. Now, there are, of course, disputes where bilateral solutions work well. For example, the Gulf of Tonkin talks between China and Vietnam. Another possibility on the horizon is the proposed gas pipeline from Sakhalin to Japan. But those situations are bound by a set of conditions, principal among which is that both parties benefit more from resolving the dispute than by continuing it. In contrast, China has opted in many bilateral disputes to put off a negotiated resolution in favor of incremental unilateral actions that gradually enhance its position in the dispute and consolidate its de facto control of a disputed area. Now let us take the bilateral approach. Sure, there are unresolved territorial land disputes between North and South Korea, Russia and Japan, China and South Korea and Japan, China and Japan, India and Pakistan, and India and China. So where is Russia in all this? It has little discernible influence on regional security decision-making at the moment, taking a back seat to China, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. It's yet to demonstrate that it's an influential player in the six-party talks in North Korea. It has, on the other hand, developed considerable oil and gas resources on Sakhalin Island and in the Sea of Okhotsk, which is perhaps the most underrated gain of the past many years, where its territorial claims were recognized to the so-called peanut hole in the center of the Sea of Okhotsk. This has tremendous underrated implications for territorial claims from the Arctic to the South China Sea and beyond. So let me turn to the presidential candidates. About 15% of Secretary Clinton's 30,000 State Department emails touched on the Asia-Pacific region. Fully 20% dealt with some aspect of the United States' relationship with China. Mr. Trump has a less voluminous record, but his footprint is nonetheless clear. What they have in common is that both have disavowed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for which Secretary Clinton helped lay the groundwork. Both claim they will renegotiate the TPP terms to the United States' advantage, and we'll see how that works out. Secretary Clinton declared that the United States has a national interest in maintaining the rule of international law in the region, especially within the contested South China Sea. It's fair to say that she made the United States a party to the dispute of its allies in the regions. Mr. Trump has also weighed in. He asserted China, quote, in the South China Sea, is in the South China Sea and building a military fortress the likes of which perhaps the world has not seen. They do that at will because they have no respect for our president and they have no respect for our country. Above all else, I maintain the candidates differ fundamentally in whether the challenge in the South China Sea and elsewhere in Asia must be approached from a multilateral, which is Secretary Clinton, or bilateral, Mr. Trump, basis. The paradigm carries over into all aspects of defense and security landscape in Asia. Thus, the matter of the United States regional nuclear umbrella for Mr. Trump becomes a bilateral matter between the United States and, respectively, South Korea and Japan. At a sophisticated level, that means a return to high-stakes summitry, which is something I've given some thought to recently. However, at a frivolous level, it simply means deal-making, in quotation marks. It's worth pondering those two approaches in the context of, say, China's threatened South China Sea Aircraft Defense Identification Zone. It has, of course, repeated its threat to establish such a zone above the South China Sea, following the Permanent Court of Arbitration's ruling undermining the legal basis for China's 9-dash line claim. Mr. Trump's approach is notably high risk. In responding to his accusations on issues of China trade and the South China Sea, Global Times, which is a tabloid affiliated with the People's Daily, said he is just, quote, talking nonsense, and if he could move forward with the anti-China campaign, then we should show him what China can do when the time comes. The shared deficiency of both candidates, if there is one, from observation is this, and it's not clear that either candidate is connected in any specific way with Asia's strategic thinking. What I mean is strategic thinking in theater itself. So less how Americans may see the theater and more how security experts in Asia see the theater. So let me end by suggesting a lightning bolt that one hope never materializes. And this is, again, in the context of trying to understand how candidates think about things, not what they've said about them. Consider that a North Korean regime pressured by the international community and determined to respond in a characteristically asymmetric way. What if subcritical quantities of special nuclear material begin to show up in unexpected places for an intended disruptive effect? How would Secretary Clinton respond to that? How would Mr. Trump respond to that? It is clearer, I think, in the former case than the latter, but I think in both cases it's interesting to contemplate, based on what they've said and temperament and approaches to problems, how each might approach a solution or a response. And I'll leave that to questions. Thank you.
Certainly a provocative ending. Okay, well, let's move along to our third speaker on this panel, Robert Liptak.
Well, thank you very much. All this talk of the geography of a pivot reminds me of John Lennon's quip, "How do you find America? Turn left at Greenland." As a non-proliferation specialist who works on a very tough Asian case, one cannot be but impressed by the extent to which North Korea is an outlier in the region. This is the most dynamic region in the world. There are trillions of dollars of GDP. And North Korea has a GDP of $40 billion, according to the CIA estimate, which puts it on a par with Jacksonville, Florida, in terms of economic activity. It is, social scientists can debate it. It seems to tick the boxes for being a failed state. It's run by a family cult, but it also has nuclear weapons. And indeed, North Korea, as Ambassador Roy discussed, is on the verge of a strategic breakout. And this strategic breakout is both quantitative and qualitative. It is quantitative because it's mastering miniaturization of warheads and long-range ballistic missiles that it could wed those warheads with. and it's quantitative. Unclassified projections of North Korea's nuclear program, its arsenal range from 20 to 100 warheads by 2020. This is the Johns Hopkins study that's in the public domain. And there's a huge difference between a North Korean nuclear arsenal of 20 weapons versus 100 weapons, particularly when they can reach the United States and pose a direct threat to the homeland, which has been accentuated by senior U.S. officials, and not just U.S. officials. I note that Prime Minister Abe in his speech at the UN said, we are into a qualitatively new realm. And that poses a challenge for all the parties who have an interest in this, including China, which seems to want to adhere to its previous approach, which no longer holds in the new context, and I'll develop that theme. After the Cold War, North Korea was called a rogue state. It was included in that category of states, and I traced the lineage of that in a volume that the chairman mentioned. And it wasn't a helpful term. I mean, rogue state captured states ranging from North Korea to Iran, Libya. It lumped them together. It distorted our approaches toward them and policies. And it had this connotation of essentially a crazy state, irrationality. North Korea is not an irrational state. We have a wonderful North Korea program here, which has an archive of historical documents that help us understand better the motivations and the nature of North Korean behavior. The Kim regime employs military adventurism in a logical manner to achieve political and economic objectives. That doesn't mean it can't miscalculate, but there is a logic attached to their actions. Nor is North Korea on the verge of collapse, has been predicted for decades now, it seems. The Kim regime has withstood societal pressures, such as the mass starvation in the 1990s, that would have toppled other governments. I mean, you could view, in a perverse way, North Korea as being almost like hyper-stable, that it could take this type of sustain this type of pressure, the pressures that would have toppled most governments, and yet through the coercive means that the regime employs, indoctrination, and coupled with indoctrination, it's managed to kind of hang in there. For the Kim family, nuclear weapons and missile tests are a source of political mobilization and a source of domestic legitimacy to them, I think. And it's a sign, the tests, and of which we've seen an accelerated tempo, are a signal of defiance to the outside world, especially the United States. The Kim regime, as my colleague Robert Daly, the head of the Kissinger Institute, has noticed, it has a conflicted attitude toward China. It's reliant on Beijing's energy and economic aid for survival, but mistrustful of Chinese intentions, and it's resentful of China's perceived encroachments over the years on North Korean sovereignty. China, which has emerged in recent decades as the power that it is in international relations, aspires to be the primary security actor in East Asia. And it has conflicting interests on the Korean Peninsula. It favors a stable DPRK, as regime collapse would precipitate a refugee crisis in northern China and create a united Korea allied to the United States. But it also wants to prevent a North Korean strategic breakout of the type I started my presentation with. That type of strategic breakout could have adverse consequences for China, such as the deployment of THAAD to South Korea. North Korea regards nuclear weapons both as a deterrent, and a deterrent that's vital to regime survival, but it's also used the nuclear program as a bargaining chip. It's one bargaining chip that he keeps playing over and over again. If it did not have nuclear weapons, this failed state with nuclear weapons, that's the subtitle of my contribution to the publication Shihoko Gato, just edited and is just released. If it didn't have nuclear weapons, it could command our attention about as much as Zimbabwe. It would be kind of a Zimbabwe is sort of North Korea without nuclear weapons. But it does command our attention because of of the nuclear weapons, and it's used this one bargaining chip. It's played it on occasion. After the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011, North Korea said that Gaddafi had been tricked into disarmament in 2003 through a U.S. assurance of regime security. And one of the instruments that has been discussed in the context of North Korean negotiations has been a security assurance to the North Korean regime. And the Libyan precedent makes that complicates our ability to kind of employ a security assurance to North Korea as part of getting them to yes on constraining their nuclear ambitions. And one can go back and say the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya was a humanitarian intervention, and at the Wilson Center we could debate the analytical distinction between a humanitarian intervention and a counterproliferation intervention, but it's a distinction without a difference if you're sitting in Kim family headquarters in Pyongyang. We now face our third nuclear crisis with North Korea, the third in 25 years. And the dilemma for U.S. policymakers is that the nuclear issue is embedded in the broader question of North Korea's societal evolution. And these timelines are not in sync. The nuclear issue is urgent, and even more urgent now that North Korea is on the verge of a strategic breakout. But the timeline for a change of regime or change within regime or societal change in North Korea is indeterminate. There have been predictions of collapse, as you're aware, for decades. So how do we manage these two timelines, which are not in sync? U.S. policy should not be based on the premise of regime collapse. In the early 2000s, the George W. Bush administration policy was premised on the view that the North Korean regime was teetering. That was the word that Paul Wolfowitz used. And if that's your assumption about the future of the North Korean regime, and you view the threat as deriving from the character of the regime, if you assume that the regime is going to go sooner than later, that changes the complexion of the non-proliferation problem. And I think it was one of the factors why the George W. Bush administration walked away from the agreed framework that had been negotiated in 1994 to contain the plutonium program, because if the program's not going to be there, if the regime's not going to be there, the problem would likewise end. And in 2002, 2003, the plutonium freeze ended. And in order to confront North Korea, and the reason that it ended was the Bush administration confronted the Kim regime with its covert uranium enrichment program. So to stop a covert uranium enrichment program of unknown scope and unknown urgency, the administration abrogated an agreement that had a plutonium program of known scope and known urgency bottled up. And in the aftermath of that, North Korea separated the plutonium and developed its first 10 or so nuclear weapons, according to unclassified estimates, and it tested its first weapon in 2006. The Bush administration, in the second Bush administration, was open to negotiations but never clarified what the U.S. objective was. Was it to change the North Korean regime, or was it to change the conduct of the regime? And this mixed message complicated the ability to re-engage the North Koreans kind of diplomatically. The Obama administration dropped the term rogue state and instead referred to North Korea as an outlier state. And in so doing, it repositioned the challenge, its characterization of the challenge posed by North Korea, not in terms of a unilateral American political concept of rogue state, but rather in terms of North Korean conduct that violated established international norms with respect to nonproliferation. And it offered North Korea a structured choice: come into compliance with its obligations that it had been party to under the NPT before it withdrew, and rejoin the proverbial community of nations, the family of nations, or face isolation and international isolation and punitive measures. The dilemma for North Korea is that what the United States is offering as an inducement, integration into the international community, the regime views as a threat to regime survival. a soft landing for the North Korean people through an economic expansion linked to its integration into the global economy. That soft landing could mean a hard landing for the Kim family regime. It's hard to see how the Kim family regime would be able to operate in that and survive in that environment. A diplomatic impasse that Ambassador Roy referred to has persisted over Pyongyang's insistence that's rejected by the United States and the rest of the international community that North Korea should be recognized as a nuclear weapon state. When North Korea rebuffed the Obama administration's diplomatic opening, President Obama referred to, "We'll extend an open hand if you'll unclench your fist," in his inaugural address. And North Korea responded, nice metaphor, North Korea responded with a nuclear weapons test and ballistic missiles test. And the Obama administration shifted to a policy under the rubric of strategic patience. The problem with strategic patience is that it has resulted in essentially acquiescing to North Korea building up its arsenal to its current level of estimated at 20 weapons or so. And it's on the verge of the strategic breakout, a breakout based on its mastery of miniaturization, long-range ballistic missiles, and just the quantitative rise in its level of the size of its arsenal. In response, the United States and the UN have imposed still stricter sanctions on the Kim regime, but sanctions are not a strategy. Which brings me to my final set of comments related to kind of next steps and what can be done. With North Korea on the verge of a strategic breakout, the United States, the Obama administration, has signaled its interest in reviving serious diplomacy. The objective of resumed diplomacy with North Korea should be to prevent this qualitative and quantitative breakout by negotiating a freeze on North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Not a rollback of the program, but a freeze by time, because 20 is better than 100, and we have to get them off that trajectory. The former director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, Sig Hecker, calls these goals the 3 no's. 1, no new nuclear weapons by freezing their plutonium and HEU programs. 2, no testing of weapons or ballistic missiles. And 3, no exports of nuclear technology or weapons. A freeze would preclude the additional testing that North Korea still needs to master miniaturization and a reliable long-range missile. So how does one get to there? Okay, first, one has to break the impasse between a U.S. position that the United States will never accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state and North Korea's insistence that it be accepted as a nuclear weapon state. That would seem to be within the kind of domain of diplomats to work out a formulation that would allow both sides to come back to the table. If we could negotiate a freeze with North Korea, there would be competing narratives. The North Koreans would say, the world's accepted us as a nuclear weapon state. The United States and its partners would say, no, this is an interim step, a freeze that is on the path toward what the Obama administration would call an aspirational goal of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. There's been much discussion about the role of China in this. President Obama raised the North Korean case in the meetings with the Chinese president, who complained about the THAAD deployment to South Korea. And President Obama said, if you don't like the THAAD deployment, then please assist in constraining North Korea's nuclear program. The New York Times referred to China as North Korea's enabler. And China has a choice now. It can either work with the United States in applying meaningful pressure on North Korea, not to collapse the regime, but to get them to agree to a freeze of the program. Or China can live with the consequences of an unconstrained North Korean program. There are revived questions of whether we are at a nuclear tipping point of whether a North Korean program that is of the scale that they are moving towards could lead other states in the region to reassess their nuclear intentions, their non-nuclear, maintaining their non-nuclear intentions. Currently, it's a minority, a vocal minority in Japan and South Korea, but these voices will perhaps gain political strength with an unconstrained North Korean nuclear program. The freeze that I've described would decouple the nuclear question from the longer-term issue of societal change. The United States and Ambassador Roy discussed the possibility of negotiating diplomatic relations with North Korea, which would be a form of reassurance for the North Koreans. The United States could, even in the wake of the Libyan precedent, essentially offer a non-aggression, pledge of no military action. But it can't provide North Korea an assurance. It cannot insulate North Korea from the consequences of any of its deeper engagement in the international community if there were to be a diplomatic settlement that allowed North Korea to escape its isolation. So let me end there, and we'll open up for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for a terrific set of issues to choose on. I'm just going to abuse my privilege here as a moderator and throw in a couple more China-related points. That we've spent a lot of time talking about what the next president, whoever she or he may be, is going to have to deal with, the sort of constants. Let me just add a couple pieces to the China side of that story. A more powerful and indeed a more assertive China. We've seen the South China Sea landform build up the dispute that went to arbitration with the Philippines, which was roundly rejected. And I think one of the things that has concerned a lot of people who watch China about this is not simply that China objected to the outcome and objected to the process, but that it was such a thorough repudiation, right? A claim, an unwillingness even to show up to contest jurisdiction, and statements after the decision that took the form of, in some cases, really crossing the line to suggest corruption or political bias. I mean, it's almost like Trump and the Mexican judge, a sense that these judges, because they were where they were from, couldn't possibly do proper justice. And there are all sorts of issues one could raise about the propriety of the tribunal and whether it got some of the law right. But this was, I think, more thoroughly rejecting in a way that I think particularly poses a challenge for Secretary Clinton if she were to win, because of the emphasis she's put on following international law in the South China Sea zone. It really makes that a sort of instant point of friction. Also, I think we have the risk that one often has with China when it faces a new American president, especially one who is not terribly tested, as Donald Trump would not be, of do you test the newbie? I mean, there was some of this with Obama in his first visit, in the sense that maybe he had yielded too much in that initial post-ascension to the presidency visit, and in some ways the Obama administration spent the following years kind of trying to claw back or recover from that criticism. So maybe there would be a test of Trump, and there might be a test of Hillary, not because they think she might prove soft. Indeed, if anything, the Chinese view is that she's quite tough and likely to be tougher than Obama on them. But because it may be an opportunity when she's still back on her heels, when there's not really a sort of fully being in place and ready to deal with China. And I'd say the whole thing is complicated by what one might call, to sort of adapt a Chinese phrase, a security dilemma with U.S.-Chinese characteristics. That is, I think, one of the problems we've got in that part of the world for U.S.-China relations under the next president is that it's been true for a while, but I think it's become more ingrained, is that the U.S. views its role in the Western Pacific, particularly its security role, as providing public goods from which everybody, including China, benefits. So if China is trying to take more of that role of regional security and a regional architecture unto itself, that looks threatening from the U.S. position, because what have you got to worry about? Why do you need to have the capacity to close off the South China Sea when we're there to make sure it's open to trade and things like that? And it seems to threaten what we would define, if we were using Chinese phrases, as our core interests. We tend to say national interests. And China has almost a mirror image view. China's just doing what great powers do. They don't rely on others for their security, for their vital sea lane access. They rely on themselves. They control their own destiny. And it's not so weird to want to have some disproportionate dominion over the areas immediately adjacent to your mainland. And Chinese love to trot out the Monroe Doctrine. Now, there's lots of asymmetries there, but it's a telling talking point. And so from the Chinese view, why does the U.S. insist on parking the 7th Fleet on its doorstep and helping out allies? It's clearly an agenda to keep China down, right? So we have this problem that each side views the other with some pretty profound distrust. Some of this is posturing, some of this is inflated, but the posturing and the statements at some level start to become mast binding. It's hard not to act to back up those things when you've said it. We've talked about North Korea, a chronic problem that's now become more acute. We've talked about the problems of allied confidence, which are which are sort of more seriously being undermined now that the TPP, which was the economic leg of the pivot, right? I mean, you have to hop instead of walk if you've only got the security side. And the repudiation of the TPP by both candidates puts in doubt the seriousness and the sort of material underpinnings of the pivot or rebalance. Taiwan pretty quiet now, but is a stalemate, a standoff, a cold peace as it's sometimes called now, a long-term stable arrangement, or is somebody going to grow impatient? The Greens, the sort of independency leaning types in Taiwan, are they going to start to push for more because China's being so recalcitrant? Will Beijing start to run out of patience? These are issues which aren't right there yet, but they're kind of over the horizon as bad case possibilities for the next president dealing with China. And we've talked some about, and I think this panel's been terrific on this, talked about the extra-regional great powers. What does the U.S. do with India? Is this China concern finally going to kick that security relationship into high gear? Do we really have a China-Russia entente emerging that is a very different alignment from how the U.S.-China relationship started nearly half a century ago? But finally, I wanted to sort of take a step back to a couple of big picture issues, which is, I think, one of the things the next president and people around him or her are going to have to think about is the degree to which the China challenge is not just about shifting power balances, shifting capabilities, but whether we're really entering an era of a contest over who writes the rules of the game. In some sense, the Obama administration got this started by framing the TPP not as the next step forward for liberalization, a sort of WTO plus, although in a mega regional trade agreement, but rather by saying it's a contest over who writes the rules for the world economy. Well, there's a security dynamic to that too, and I think particularly if we look at the South China Sea, you're seeing possibly some hints of that. Secretary Clinton, again, has emphasized international law following, keeping the seas open, using peaceful means to resolve disputes. And China says we're never going to shut off the sea, but that is an act of grace rather than a binding principle. It doesn't say that we have no right to do so. And I think if you look at a lot of what's roiled around the South China Sea, at least some Chinese positions are much more a closed sea position, an objection to the U.S. strategic role in the region as not just threatening Chinese interests, but threatening Chinese core interests, and as having the wrong view over the relative rights of China and the U.S. as a distant state in the region. The right to assert security control, to tell the U.S. that it shouldn't be there doing what it's doing, and the South China Sea, ADIZ, would be just another step down that path. That's one obvious area. Regulation of the internet is another. And I would point out, not that I take plenum communiques all that seriously, but the fourth plenum of the 18th Central Committee was all about building the rule of law and all that. Some progress, some not so impressive lack of progress on the domestic side of that, but there's a paragraph buried near the end where China says, our goal should be to shape international legal rules for the next century. I mean, it really is very much the mirror image of the way TPP was presented here. And so we've gone through, I think, this strange arc where not too many years ago we used to talk about Chinese soft power, the Beijing consensus, a China model that others in the world might emulate. Well, that kind of got thrown under the bus as South China Sea and East China Sea tensions started heating up. But in the last few years, and this is something that President Trump or President Clinton or President Johnson or President Stein, I guess we should say, are going to have to deal with, which is that we're seeing, I think, more and more Xi Jinping era China, which is not just saying we reject the imposition of the Western model and architecture, the US-led version everywhere, but that China actually presents, and you see a lot of this in official rhetoric, a superior alternative. It doesn't have the dysfunctional politics that the US has. That's been great, heyday in Chinese critiques. It has efficient meritocratic governance. It can create its own Chinese-led architecture, whether it be One Belt, One Road, the AIIB, or various security relationships, which the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was a sort of early example of. And so that if that kind of more ideational conflict takes off, it doesn't mean a new Cold War. There's too much economic interdependence. The contest for influence in this part of the world, at least for the long foreseeable future, isn't about intervention and putting in puppet governments or territorial ambitions and so on. And there are real bright spots, things like climate change. The accord there is really quite promising if it can be followed through on. But we do have this possible competition that I think is going to be at a more ideological or ideational level than we've seen in recent decades. And whether you buy all that or not, I think it is at least pretty clearly evident that the era of the belief that a U.S. policy of engagement with China would somehow socialize the Chinese regime into accepting values that the U.S. favors. Remember, that's how the WTO was sold. It would change China internally. China would be in all these organizations, and we would have a greater commonality of views. You know, that discussion, I think, has really changed in this city and more broadly in the U.S. to where it is much more a question about how much what the U.S. does helps or doesn't help a potential rival and how to calibrate the incentive to get China to cooperate on much more discrete issues rather than thinking big picture about how perhaps to change China, which, to get back to Ambassador Roy's earlier comment, is an idea that goes all the way back to the Mongols at least and hasn't been terribly successful. It's not an easy place to change because it has its own sense of self and sense of role, and I think we're seeing one of the cyclical resurgences of that. So with that, let me throw it open to the audience for questions, comments, and other issues. And I would say please identify yourself and please keep your questions brief and please put your answer in the form of a question. All right, who has the microphones? There, why don't we go? Start with you since you're near a microphone. Yes, the woman. What? The row you're standing next to. Get to her, please. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. Chinese visiting fellow, I have actually very short 2 questions for Dr. Smith. The first is on Afghanistan, what do you think are the limits of United States currently, and also in case of increasing India's role, what do you think are Indians' constraints on that? The second question is on the cyber security between India and the United States. What do you think might be the orientations and possible approaches they would adopt? Thank you.
Okay, in the interest of getting us to get to more questions, why don't we take one more question now and then we'll throw it to the panel.
Actually, my name is Tong Kim with the Korea Times. Actually, I have 3 questions. For the first
We'll
speaker.
take 5 questions at once.
Okay. For the first speaker, you talked about the improving security relations between India and United States. Have you ever thought in terms of the U.S. rebalances to or pivot to Asia in terms of the security arrangement, which China sees as if it's being encircled by U.S. Expansion of allies and partners, including India, which is a recent thing, especially after the breakout of the South Sea China affairs. And also, how would you see contrast between Sino-Pakistani relationship vis-a-vis U.S.-Indian relationship in terms of security relations? And second question is to the gentleman sitting in the middle. You talked about Clintons and Trump's or what they might do, what you understand what they might do. I have one specific question. I know both candidates refutes TPP, but what my question is economic one. That is, Trump says he's going to make new deals with China to correct the imbalances which United States suffers about $500 billion every year in trade, according to Trump. And he said he's going to negotiate. He says he's a great negotiator. How he's going to do that? That's my question. Now, third question, who talked about North Korea a lot. I talked to Ambassador Roy during the breakout, and he says North Korea would never come to talks, even if the next administration begins engaging North Korea in dialogue again on the subject of denuclearization. Therefore, you talk about freeze. He says he would not even, North Koreans would not even be interested in that. And you talk about strategic break point. I think it has happened in my personal view. Now, Ambassador Roy thinks U.S. will have to make a break. A real big decision, political decision, that is to taking actions, military actions, to
I think
moderation
we've got the gist of the
actions
question.
to make North Koreans feel easy about their own security concerns, then see what happens, how North Korean attitude might change.
All right, I think there's something there for everybody on our panel, so why don't we go back down the line?
Okay. On the limits of the U.S. Role in Afghanistan, I'll be, in the interests of time, I'll be completely blunt about it. Unless one can restrain Pakistan's involvement with the Haqqani network, the U.S. simply will not be able to stabilize Afghanistan. Everything else is a pie in the sky. Let me be quite succinct about it. And the U.S. has to grasp this nettle and simply cannot continue to dance around this subject. This is something that we have known for a long time. Admiral Mullen, in open testimony, referred to the Haqqani network as a arm of the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. Nothing more needs to be said on the subject. On the Indian role in Afghanistan, India had been kept at an arm's length from Afghanistan principally because of Pakistani sentiments, because Pakistan argues, or more appropriately, the Pakistani military argues, that India was conducting a kind of a pincer movement of trapping Pakistan on the east and the west. Nothing could be further from the truth, because the Indian investments in Afghanistan are primarily in the health sector, in the social sector, and in road building. There is little or no evidence of Indian military involvement in Afghanistan, except in the last few months, when with the US imprimatur, India has taken a wider role in the training of the Afghan National Army and has provided a couple of Soviet-era helicopter gunships. Beyond that, there has not been any Indian security role in Afghanistan. So the argument that India was conducting a pincer movement is a piece of fantasy. The Indian role in Afghanistan can become much more substantial if the US permits India to play a wider role in the stabilization of the country, and the current regime in New Delhi is eager to play such a role. On cybersecurity, there has been considerable discussion, and in fact there is a working group on Indo-US cybersecurity issues, but because of the very expansive role of the National Security Agency, which was revealed by Edward Snowden, the Indians have been somewhat hesitant in terms of expanding the scope of cooperation with the United States, for fear that some of their own security could be compromised by the expansion of a wider relationship with the United States in this realm. So progress has been rather fitful. To turn to the questions of the other individual, the Indo-US security relationship is primarily driven by the growth of Chinese power, the increasing assertiveness of the PRC in the Indian Ocean, and consequently a convergence of interests between India and the United States. The Sino-Pakistan relationship is of very long standing. It goes back to 1963. The Chinese refer to it as an all-weather relationship, and it's primarily because of the common hostility towards India. That's what cements this relationship and provides a foundation for this relationship. And this relationship will continue for the foreseeable future, particularly as China expands this idea of the One Belt, One Road, and also is promising to invest something like $40 billion in Pakistan over the next several years to build an economic corridor which will give China access to the Arabian Sea. I was, not to be overly self-referential, but I just gave an interview to the Financial Times yesterday on the whole issue of this belt that is being built through Pakistan in an insurgency-prone region called Balochistan. And so I'm somewhat skeptical about how much of this $40 billion will actually see the light of day, given the fact that the pipelines, the roads, and the other investments go through an area which is laden with the world's longest running and the least known insurgency going back to the 1970s.
The question was to Mr. Trump's promised renegotiation of the TPP with China. I think it's an illustration of what I was discussing with his strong bent towards bilateralism. I think Mr. Trump views multilateral approaches as inherently flawed. I think an illustration of that is his view of NATO. He views NATO as a principally American vehicle with which we allow other nations to associate, assuming that they do so on terms that we've specified. I believe he would take the same approach on the trade side, which is his belief is that he can sit down and negotiate one-on-one agreements with other countries, and then may or may not, as circumstances provide, allow other nations to associate themselves with the terms that those two have agreed.
With respect to the North Korean question addressed to me, the discussion has North Korea have they achieved this breakout or not is debated. There's a sense that they need an additional 2-3 years of testing to really have assurance on the miniaturization and a reliable long-range ballistic missile that could reach the United States. So there is still a window in terms of the technology of re-engaging North Korea kind of diplomatically to freeze the program and prevent the strategic breakout. And the role of China, is pivotal here. I remember, a colleague at the NSC once mentioning, the formulation was North Korea does not respond to pressure, but without pressure, North Korea does not respond. And China is the one country that can put meaningful pressure on North Korea. We understand the limits of the pressure they are willing to impose because of the fear of regime collapse. The objective would be to get North Korea to freeze the program, not to collapse the regime. It would not be a rollback of the program at this stage. It really would be to buy time by freezing the program. And here the precedent with Iran is relevant because that agreement constrained the Iranian nuclear program at a much earlier stage in development, just to a limited uranium enrichment program. It was not a full rollback of Iranian capabilities. But this would be in my view, a fruitful diplomatic line for the next administration to explore.
Okay, great. So we have a gentleman at the end of this row, and then in the row behind, 3 seats in.
Thank you. Excuse me. No voice. Marvin Ott, Wilson Center and Johns Hopkins University, formerly federal government. This is basically about North Korea. Quick aside, I, for one, have no problem with the concept of pivot, simply reprioritization, refocus, deployments. I don't know why you have to get into cartography of flat versus spherical entities, but at any rate, that's an aside. On North Korea, I'll take the reference to State Roy's comment, the North Koreans will never come to the table to negotiate denuclearization. My own guess is that, in fact, is correct. And if that is correct, then we're facing some really tough choices. And I'd like to hear both Rob and maybe Jacques might weigh in on this. Where do you go when it becomes clear that the North Koreans are not interested in a freeze? Seems to me the options come down to not just THAAD, but reintroducing American nuclear weapons into the peninsula, the possibility of an ROK nuclear program, and then finally a preemptive American strike on the North Korean nuclear facilities.
I'm Guo Xuetang from Shanghai, China, and now based as a visiting scholar at GW. I have questions to Professor Ganguly. I do think you like questions. I have just one question for you. Improvement of U.S.-Indian relations are moved in past, particularly in second term of my administration, as you mentioned, have moved improve a lot because of the China's rise, as you mentioned. The military cooperation and diplomatic and the educations in the last several years, it seems that give Modi governments great confidence that to play a larger role in South Asia and also East Asia. For example, as you mentioned, to improve the role in Afghanistan, to act east foreign policy, and improve the military relation with Vietnam. And we want to also involve in the military presence in South China Sea. So all this you have, as you also mentioned, that makes Modi government more confident, so want to play or also China care much about that. It's what kind of role India want to play in the future. So the question is actually is how do you think the strategic goal of India in the next decades, for example, does it want to maintain our economic growth like China 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that China maintain our economic growth, want to become economic power, or it just want to join a kind of balanced power to play, to contain similar, something many Chinese regard as contain China's rise, that so as to India can play a hegemonic role in South Asia and Southeast Asia.
I think we.
Yes,
can
that's my
answer the
question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so we start with the North Korea question.
Well, thanks very much for the comment, the question about kind of options. They're not good. I mean, at the kind of the hard containment end, if you can't, if diplomacy doesn't open the door to a freeze, and we have to deal with North Korea with a very large nuclear arsenal with ballistic missiles, then the strategic environment will have changed, substantially, and there will be a response. At the hard end, there's been discussion of a blockade on North Korea, a naval blockade, kind of a Cuban Missiles type quarantine. The land door to China's, would not be affected by that, but that would be a risky, very risky move. Military preemption has been discussed since the early 1990s, and one of the difficulties of preemption is that we no longer know all the targets. I mean, North Korea separated plutonium and it's a small arsenal, and it's dispersed, and they're adept at digging tunnels and squirreling things away. So, as Napoleon said, if you're going to take Vienna, but we don't know where some of these targets are. There has been a simulated U.S. South Korean exercises attacking a missile complex. That if it was clear that North Koreans were teeing up a ballistic missile launch, there would be warning signals of that, and they could be struck. But the military options are just so bad. And this goes back to the early 1990s. General Luck, who was then, you'll recall, the commanding officer, talked about, a trillion and a million, like a $1 trillion war and 1 million casualties. And because of the North Korean forward deployed artillery and probably chemical weapons and the close, the adjacency of Seoul to the border, it is not a good option. If we go to kind of pressure, if the door on engagement is closed and we go to more pressure, one could envision the ramping up of pressure on North Korea through China, and through China. That is, Iran-type banking restrictions on North Korea make it very difficult to get the Toro, the Johnny Walker, the Mercedes. Some of this is already happening. The estimated $1 billion to keep the Kim family regime kind of sated, and also pose a choice to Chinese banks. Do you want to do business in the United States of America in dollars, or do you want to do business with North Korea? and really sharpen the choice. I think that's a phrase that was used in the recent Council on Foreign Relations. And this is all with an eye to China, of saying, you know, you have a choice now. You can remain an enabler and sort of claim this is, as the British would say, ain't got nothing to do with me, mate. Or they can be part of the solution, as they were constructively on Iran. And this opens the door to the broader question that Jacques mentioned, is like this long-standing debate, is China being socialized or not? China has gotten somewhat better on proliferation issues, though the two countries of concern, North Korea and Pakistan, you know, thanks to A.Q. Khan and the Chinese transfers of essentially giving Pakistan a nuclear weapon, have been major drivers of the proliferation challenges we face now.
I'll just speak to the China angle on that, which is to echo a lot of what Bob just said, that you know, it seems to me the U.S. tactic for getting China to play more cooperatively on this is essentially to try to rearrange what is our bad mismatch of bad case scenarios, right? And I think there's some opening there in that Chinese who work on the North Korea issue have become increasingly frustrated with North Korea. You know, it's a difficult regime for them. It's kind of embarrassing, and it does create diplomatic headaches. And it's, you know, somewhat telling that Xi Jinping has not really been terribly open to the youngest Kim. And I think China over the years has come to appreciate the potential and the potential fragility of its improved relations with South Korea. So you don't want to, you know, mess that up. So I think, you know, the more the U.S. says things like, you know, you don't, as Obama said, you don't like the missile defense system? Well, cooperate on North Korea. You don't want U.S. nuclear arms going back onto the peninsula. You don't want a closer U.S.-South Korea relationship. You don't want a united Korean peninsula. You don't want South Korea taking Donald Trump's possible invitation to go nuclear. Those are all worse for you than helping us solve this problem, or at least manage this problem. And I think Chinese banks are actually going to be an important leverage point, as you just suggested, because that's something that hits China in a sector that is both important to the government and that is in some trouble these days for all the non-performing loan stuff that we've got going. And so I think you push on all those things. Will it solve it? I don't know, but it may at least get us some incremental help. And of course, you know, the Chinese are fully aware of the really bad case scenarios of U.S. intervention, but I think, you know, who knows? It's a fairly opaque system, but at least some folks think the U.S. is not likely to go there just because of the, you know, even absent really, really even worse situations that we've got now. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that it's taken terribly credibly. So there were other questions.
Yeah. What's India's principal strategic goal in the years ahead? First of all, I don't accept your sort of dichotomous idea that it's either to pursue economic growth or to contain China. Obviously, the pursuit of economic growth is vitally important for India, especially because it adds 1 million people every month to its workforce. So without robust economic growth at 7 to 8% annually, the country is going to be faced with a major internal problem of social stability unless it can absorb this very substantial number of young people who are entering the workforce. So pursuing economic growth, regardless of regime, is going to be an imperative that any government in New Delhi will have to pursue. I disagree with your notion that there is any interest in containing China. Other than perhaps the lunatic fringe in India, no one seriously considers that India could serve in a role that would seek to contain China. However, balancing Chinese power and balancing Chinese assertiveness is certainly a goal of Indian policymakers, and particularly of the present regime. And that also explains in considerable part its willingness to increasingly move closer to the United States. But the notion of containing China is simply beyond the pale.
Okay, we have a question on 3 seats in here.
Thank you very much. I was intrigued by Jacques' comment that it basically comes down to the question, who is writing the rules of the game? Will it be China or will it be the United States? It seems to me that the obvious answer to that is it shouldn't be either. It should really be a multilateral process. And my question to the panel is, what are the major obstacles to make that obvious solution a reality? What is in the way of China and the US accepting that they cannot unilaterally write the rules of the games, but that they have to submit to a multilateral process?
Okay, I think there's another question near the back there. Yes, the gentleman, yes, yeah. And I think after this, we'll probably, after we respond to these, we'll probably have a round we can fit in. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Yatish. I'm at the Indian Embassy, though I ask this in my personal capacity. This is addressed to Mr. Ganguly. I was hoping to get your views on, so we've spoken about the Chinese-Pakistani relationships. I was hoping to get your views on what the United States approaches the growing Russian-Pakistani relationship that's taking place, and whether the issue is of any concern here or is viewed. I'd just like to know how it's viewed. I asked this, of course, in the backdrop of, say, around like 10 hours ago, there is the first Russian-Pakistani joint military exercise took off, and Russian troops landed in Pakistan. So I'd like to get a broad perspective on the U.S. stance on the matter.
Okay, and I think there was another question just a few rows ahead next to our earlier questions. Is one up there? Yes, the man with the gentleman with his hand up there. Yeah.
Hi, Phil Schrafer, retired. For Professor Haynes, I believe you said that Russia and Putin have no respect for the Obama administration. If I heard that correctly, I wonder how you draw that conclusion, given that Russia cooperated in the Iran treaty, Russia's cooperating with the NASA projects, giving us some access to Afghanistan, cooperated with the chemical weapons withdrawal from Syria. I suspect the sanctions that America's helped implement for the invasion of Crimea. So I suspect there is some respect there.
Wants to
Well, to that question, I don't believe I did say that. What I said was I think they don't have respect for their approach to problem solving in certain arenas. That's not that they don't have respect for the United States. I think it's self-evident that they do, and it'd be foolish to think otherwise. I think the addendum to that would be what Russia is increasingly insisting on in a vocal way is that they see that reciprocated. Now, how Russians view reciprocation and how we view it are two rather different things, and we could talk about that for a long time, which we don't have. But I think the difference may frankly be there.
On the emergence of a Russian-Pakistani nexus, I was under the impression that actually that the military exercise had been cancelled. That's what I had read, and this had caused much delight in New Delhi, and the Russians had said they were cancelling the military exercises because of Pakistan's likely involvement in the terrorist attack on an Indian military camp in Kashmir last week. But I could be corrected on this, but this is the latest word that I had as of yesterday when I was reading a couple of the Indian newspapers online. The U.S. has not taken a particular stand on this, but all I can suggest is that obviously Russia is trying to step into the breach, that U.S.-Pakistan relations in the recent past have been somewhat strained. The U.S. Congress has held up a substantial tranche of money, which was designated for Pakistan up to $300 million, has refused to transfer a set of F-16 aircraft to elicit better cooperation from Pakistan on Afghanistan. And obviously, the Russians are trying to exploit the breach. On the military exercises, I'm afraid we may simply have different information on what has transpired or has not.
Yeah, on the multilateral, bilateral issue, I mean, I think one shouldn't overdraw the claim that it's a contest between the U.S. and China to, quote, write the rules of the system. The bit that I quoted from the TPP debates, I mean, that was driven by domestic politics. I mean, it was an attempt to sell to a very reluctant Congress and a broader public that is, as we've seen even more so since that discussion, it was seen as the campaign's heated up, is very skeptical about trade liberalization and general economic integration. So you sell it in security terms, and when you sell it in security terms, it's about rivalry and who wins and who loses, very zero sum. That said, I think there is some having to swim upstream if you really want to sell multilateralism in a world in which China and the U.S. are the most influential states. Neither one has a great record of joining regimes. It is, somewhat reconstructed history, but true enough as history that the world we live in is a post-war set of institutions largely created by the U.S. and now closely identified with the U.S. as the principal underwriter of them. The Chinese phrase, was never we should write the rules on our own. It's that China wants a place at the table writing the rules. So the G8 to G20 shift, that whole rearrangement is part of it. But, it coexists with this growing sense of China, should be given the kind of deference due a great power, which China has long been denied. And so you have these Sino-centric, as it were, initiatives. I mean, it's hard not to view the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, founded in Shanghai, as being kind of a China thing. The AIIB certainly is too. And, you get the occasional Chinese muscle flexing where you get, statements, we're a big country, you're a small country. That's all, I think, baked in a little bit. And there are cases in which it makes a great deal of at least short-term self-interested sense, and that's what you see as State Roy is talking about, China's preference for bilateral dealings with its neighbors. I mean, if you've got a one-on-one situation near the big country, well, that's not a bad way to be dealing. ASEAN Centrale was meant to deal with the problem that you had a bunch of small, weak countries that could be more effective if they could cooperate. And China's been quite effective in some ways of splitting ASEAN over the South China Sea issues, basically the inland countries versus the disputants. So I think that's just, the nature of the game that gets played, and it would almost be irrational to give that up unless you had the kind of long-term strategic vision and the sort of fortitude to stick with it that would see the virtues you're talking about, which might ultimately serve Chinese interests better and serve U.S. interests better. And as Stape also pointed out, it doesn't help that we don't join a lot of treaties, which create the framework for some of these multilateral structures.
I just would reiterate the point that Ambassador Roy made, that America kind of can lead best when we're seen to be living up to our own values. And much of international law it's a voluntaristic system. States, we talk about proliferation issues, but give them their due. India, Pakistan, Israel did not sign up for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They exercised their sovereign right to just opt out of it. We live, it's an international system where the rules, as Jacques described, and former fellow here, John Eichenberry at Princeton, has written extensively about how it's sort of, the current international system has a made in America sort of stamp on it. And China will, by being within the system, push back and try to have its power translate into how rules are interpreted and set. And I think that's sort of the normal course of things. It doesn't help when the United States, for example, does the nuclear deal with India, kind of flouting non-proliferation kind of norms. It's hard from the Chinese perspective. It's hard for us to hold the line on North Korea and Pakistan when, from their perspective, it looks like we just sort of selectively comply with rules to accord with our own interests, sell ballistic missiles to other countries and try to block their ballistic missile transfers or whatever the particular issue would be.
I think we're pretty much up against our time limit, so I just wanted to say one thing in closing and thank our panelists. Just to bring this back to the focus on the electoral outcomes and such. I think one of the other things, particularly in the U.S.-China relationship, is we're dealing with a moment of real opacity and uncertainty about what the other guy's leaders are going to do. One of the consequences of Xi Jinping's concentration of power in his own hands is the people we all talk to don't really have as much knowledge or influence about Chinese policymaking as they used to. The intellectuals and the think tanks and the universities and some of the ministries. So it's going to be hard for the next president to get as good a fix on where China is going that I think has been true in the past. And there's opacity on the other side. John and others on the panel have talked about trying to tease out of the the Delphic utterings of Donald Trump, what exactly the positions are going to be. And to be a little more self-referential than Sumit was, I've got a piece on the FPRI website about why China is somewhat positively disposed toward Trump. Not pro-Trump, but relatively open to it, at least in less of a panic than many others are. And I think it's because he's kind of a Rorschach test. I mean, is he the businessman who wants to keep the economic relationship on an even keel, but in a more beneficial arrangement with renegotiation? Is he a wheeler dealer who will make any deal with anybody over everything? Is he an isolationist that's going to get the U.S. out of China's face? Is he going to be the source of the great American comeuppance when we get into real trouble in governing our own house and our external behavior? You know, is he Donald the Destroyer? He's going to take the U.S. down? Or is it simply that he's not Hillary? And that's a big part of the appeal. He's not Hillary. And here I think there's a different kind of potential misunderstanding, which is Hillary does not have a good reputation in China. And there's a view that she's behind the pivot and the rebalance. That was her doing. She's more hawkish than Obama in this view. And she is, quote, ideological, which seems kind of strange, right? And what that refers to is her long pushing of human rights issues back to the UN Women's Conference when she was First Lady and so on. And there's confusion over whether she is really serious about dropping the TPP or not, because she's been on both sides of that. And finally, I think there's a little bit of concern on the Taiwan issue, because she was on record as saying Taiwan shouldn't be too dependent on China economically. That has political risks. So both sides are looking at the other, trying to figure out what the heck's going to happen. The good news is that after our election, or at least after our inauguration, we'll have a fairly good view pretty quickly of what the U.S. president's policy is going to be. Xi Jinping may still be a little harder to read, even though some features of a tougher, more muscular foreign policy are certainly pretty well baked in at that point. Speaking of baked in, it's time for lunch. Ashoka, where is lunch? Just across the hall? All right, so follow the crowd, follow the fumes, and please join me in thanking my colleagues on the panel.
Thanks.
We started 5 minutes late.
Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.